How long did this mistake?
It lasted, I'd say, about 2 years.
Yeah. 2 years?
About a year. I know a year.
You say that relationship produced a daughter, but Ms. Richmond claims you are not her daughter's biological father. And so how do you end up having an affair with your sister's husband?
Not thinking, just being wild at that time of my age, and just not caring about anything. I can admit to that.
That was an honest mistake, Your Honor. But at the same...
Wait, now there wasn't no mistaken identity.
Yeah,
you knew it was your wife's
I
sister.
understand.
Was it an honest mistake or a dishonest mistake?
Dishonest mistake.
This wasn't no mistake.
Yeah.
This was a decision.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For 2 years, you were sleeping with your wife's sister.
Yes.
Regularly?
Yes.
Often, very often.
Without protection?
Without protection.
This court case unfolds as a layered examination of family, responsibility, and unanswered questions, overseen by Judge Lauren Lake, where the evidence stage becomes the center of emotional gravity rather than legal theatrics. The story being explained here focuses entirely on what happens inside the courtroom, how each person arrives with a different version of truth, and how the process of justice slowly separates belief from biological fact. From the very beginning, the court makes it clear that this is not entertainment but a serious divorce case-adjacent paternity matter in which history, secrecy, and personal choices collide. At the heart of the case is a long-standing paternity dispute involving a woman who has lived her entire life without certainty about her biological father. She comes to court seeking clarity, not revenge. Her mother is present, along with multiple men whose names have been associated with the period of conception. The court recognizes that this situation represents more than a simple DNA test. It reflects the relationship between law and justice, where legal procedures must account for emotional harm accumulated over decades. Judge Lauren Lake emphasizes that the court is not here to shame, but to establish facts according to the Evidence Act and accepted standards of jurisprudence. As the proceedings begin, the court hears how affairs, secrecy, and avoidance created a chain reaction that followed the child into adulthood. This explanation highlights how people regret taking truth lightly in the past, only to be forced to confront it under oath years later. The testimony shows that the mother herself is uncertain, offering conflicting timelines and acknowledging multiple relationships during the conception window. This admission places the court in a difficult position, requiring reliance on forensic science rather than memory or personal conviction. Throughout the hearing, the evidence stage reveals inconsistencies. Paperwork from earlier years is discussed, including references to prior testing that may or may not have occurred. Judge Lauren Lake carefully explains adverse inference in Evidence Act principles, clarifying that missing records and conflicting claims cannot substitute for verified DNA results. This moment reinforces the concept of justice in jurisprudence, where the burden is not emotional certainty but factual proof. The daughter speaks openly about growing up without a father, describing identity confusion, emotional distance, and the long-term psychological cost of unanswered questions. Her words echo themes commonly discussed in adoption stories' full episodes, where identity and origin play central roles in personal development. The court listens as she explains how not knowing her biological roots affected her relationships, self-worth, and sense of belonging. These statements are not treated as dramatic embellishments, but as relevant context for understanding the stakes of the case. Judge Lauren Lake repeatedly steers the courtroom back to purpose. She explains that while the pain is real, the court's responsibility is resolution. This reflects a broader philosophy often explored in the Truth Changes Everything podcast and the Game Changing Attorney podcast, where legal outcomes are framed as turning points rather than endpoints. The judge stresses that the DNA test is not a weapon but a tool, one that can either confirm long-held beliefs or dismantle them entirely. As multiple potential fathers are discussed, the court addresses how rumors and assumptions replaced accountability over the years. One man believed for decades that he was the father, building emotional certainty without legal confirmation. Another maintained distance, uncertain but unwilling to step forward. These dynamics illustrate DNA test cheating stories in a non-sensational way, showing how infidelity and secrecy ripple outward, affecting children most of all. When the DNA results are finally prepared, the courtroom atmosphere shifts from argument to anticipation. Judge Lauren Lake explains the scientific process clearly, ensuring that everyone understands the reliability and finality of the results. This transparency reinforces trust in the system and underscores why Supreme Court child support precedents rely heavily on genetic certainty rather than testimony alone. The results themselves bring mixed outcomes. One man, convinced of paternity for decades, is ruled out biologically. The court carefully manages this moment, acknowledging the emotional impact while reinforcing that biological truth does not erase shared history or moral responsibility. This distinction is critical, showing how law defines relationships differently than lived experience. Judge Lauren Lake encourages emotional accountability even where legal ties are severed. In another portion of the proceedings, a second case is addressed involving a young woman whose mother listed numerous possible fathers. This segment highlights how unresolved paternity can fracture family relationships beyond repair. Arguments erupt, emotions escalate, and the court must repeatedly intervene to restore order. Here, the courtroom becomes a space where celebrate recovery testimonies unfold unintentionally, as participants confront past mistakes and long-avoided conversations. The court orders DNA testing for the remaining identified men. One candidate has already formed a bond with the daughter, offering emotional support despite uncertainty. When his results exclude him as the biological father, the disappointment is profound but handled with dignity. Judge Lauren Lake emphasizes that emotional presence still holds value, even when genetics do not align. This reinforces the idea that fatherhood is both biological and relational, though the court can only rule on one. The final DNA result confirms paternity with another man, a revelation that triggers shock, denial, and anger. The daughter struggles to accept the outcome, expressing fear rather than relief. Judge Lauren Lake explains that answers do not always bring peace immediately, a theme often explored in the Divorce Course podcast and discussions about healing after legal resolution. The court makes it clear that truth is only the beginning of accountability, not its conclusion. Throughout the explanation of this courtroom story, the focus remains on process rather than spectacle. Every participant is shown responding to the same evidence differently, shaped by years of belief, regret, and avoidance. The court's role is to anchor these reactions in verified fact, ensuring that future decisions about child support, identity, and family structure rest on certainty rather than assumption. By the end of the hearing, the court adjourns with answers delivered but healing still incomplete. Judge Lauren Lake reminds all parties that while the court can determine biological truth, it cannot force emotional reconciliation. That work continues outside the courtroom, shaped by honesty, responsibility, and willingness to confront the past. This case stands as a clear example of how DNA testing intersects with law, emotion, and identity. It demonstrates why people regret taking truth lightly, and why, once revealed, truth truly changes everything. As the courtroom proceedings continue, the focus shifts from shock to interpretation, from raw reaction to long-term consequence. Judge Lauren Lake carefully reframes the outcome, reminding everyone present that a DNA test does not exist in isolation. It operates within the broader relationship between law and justice, where truth must be acknowledged even when it disrupts emotional comfort. The court makes clear that denial, anger, or disbelief are natural reactions, but they cannot override verified evidence. The daughter's response becomes central at this stage. Rather than celebrating certainty, she expresses fear and resistance, illustrating a lesser-discussed reality in DNA test people regret taking truth discussions. The court acknowledges that some individuals find stability in uncertainty, and that definitive answers can feel like loss instead of relief. Judge Lauren Lake explains that identity, once built on assumptions, does not automatically reorganize itself when facts change. This acknowledgement grounds the proceedings in realism rather than moral judgment. Attention then returns to the mother's role. Her testimony is examined again, not to assign punishment, but to clarify responsibility. The court addresses how withholding information, minimizing timelines, or presenting shifting narratives can create long-term harm. Judge Lauren Lake explains that while the law does not criminalize confusion or youthful decisions, it does recognize the downstream impact of avoidance. This moment reinforces the concept of justice in jurisprudence, where accountability includes acknowledging emotional consequences even when legal fault is limited. The courtroom discussion highlights how unresolved paternity issues often intersect with divorce case dynamics, even when no formal divorce filing is present. Affairs, secrecy, and divided loyalties mirror patterns seen in marital dissolution cases, where children become collateral witnesses to adult decisions. Judge Lauren Lake emphasizes that the court's role is not to rewrite the past, but to prevent continued harm by establishing clarity. As the evidence stage concludes, the judge revisits procedural safeguards, explaining how DNA results are collected, verified, and interpreted. This explanation serves a dual purpose, educating the participants and reinforcing trust in the outcome. References are made to standards that align with Supreme Court child support precedents, where genetic certainty underpins enforceable responsibility. The court makes clear that emotional bonds do not negate legal definitions, but they also do not vanish simply because biology disagrees. The narrative then expands to the broader implications for the daughter's children. Judge Lauren Lake points out that unresolved identity issues can echo across generations. This observation connects the case to themes often explored in adoption stories' full episodes, where descendants inherit unanswered questions. By addressing this openly, the court reframes the DNA test as not just a personal resolution, but a preventative measure for future confusion. The confirmed biological father reacts with visible disbelief. His initial response reflects the shock frequently discussed in DNA test cheating stories, where long-held assumptions collapse instantly. Judge Lauren Lake addresses him directly, outlining the responsibilities that accompany biological confirmation. She explains that paternity is not merely a label but a legal and ethical position that carries expectations of support, respect, and consistency. The court does not permit emotional avoidance, making it clear that acknowledgement is the first step toward accountability. Tension arises as family members react differently to the result. Some express cautious openness, while others remain defensive. The judge intervenes repeatedly to keep the focus on resolution rather than conflict. She explains that the courtroom is not a space for rewriting family history through blame, but for establishing a foundation on which healthier relationships might eventually form. This perspective aligns with discussions found in the Game Changing Attorney podcast, where legal outcomes are framed as structural resets rather than emotional fixes. The daughter's fear is addressed directly. Judge Lauren Lake validates her hesitation, explaining that acceptance does not have to be immediate. The court recognizes that answers can destabilize identity before rebuilding it. This moment mirrors insights from the Truth Changes Everything podcast, where guests often describe delayed emotional processing after life-altering revelations. The judge encourages patience and emphasizes that healing is not dictated by the court's timeline. As proceedings draw toward closure, Judge Lauren Lake summarizes the findings with clarity and restraint. She reiterates that the DNA results are final, that legal recognition follows biological fact, and that future steps regarding child support or familial contact must be approached thoughtfully. The court avoids issuing moral verdicts, instead emphasizing informed choice going forward. The discussion briefly revisits adverse inference in Evidence Act principles, explaining that the absence of earlier verified tests contributed to decades of uncertainty. This serves as a cautionary note, underscoring the importance of timely resolution. The court highlights that delayed truth often compounds harm, a lesson relevant far beyond this single case. In her concluding remarks, Judge Lauren Lake addresses all parties collectively. She speaks about regret, acknowledging that many people in the room wish different choices had been made. However, she reframes regret as a starting point rather than an endpoint. This reflection echoes themes found in Celebrate Recovery testimonies, where acknowledgement precedes growth. The court emphasizes that while the law can compel compliance, it cannot manufacture reconciliation. The session ends not with celebration, but with sober understanding. The courtroom empties with answers established but emotions unresolved. The daughter leaves with certainty she did not anticipate needing time to accept. The biological father leaves with responsibility he did not expect to carry. The mother leaves confronted by the long shadow of past decisions. This continuation of the courtroom story reinforces a central truth. DNA tests do not simply reveal biology, they expose history. Under Judge Lauren Lake's guidance, the court demonstrates how law can deliver clarity without cruelty, and how justice, when applied carefully, respects both evidence and humanity. Truth has been delivered, and as the case shows, it does indeed change everything. As the courtroom reaches its final phase, the weight of what has been established begins to settle in a quieter, more reflective way. Judge Lauren Lake makes it clear that while the court session may be ending, the consequences of the truth revealed here are only beginning to unfold. This is a defining characteristic of cases centered on DNA testing. The legal answer arrives in a single moment, but emotional understanding often lags far behind. The court revisits the purpose of bringing such matters forward so late in life. Judge Lauren Lake explains that many people delay seeking answers because uncertainty feels safer than disruption. This is why DNA test people regret taking truth is not just a phrase but a lived reality. Truth, once confirmed, cannot be reshaped or ignored, and the court acknowledges that some individuals are not immediately prepared for the permanence of that knowledge. Still, the judge reinforces that clarity is essential for justice to function. Attention turns once more to the concept of responsibility. The confirmed biological father is reminded that paternity is not conditional on readiness or emotional comfort. The law recognizes biology as a foundation for obligation, especially when it comes to acknowledgement, respect, and potential child support considerations. Judge Lauren Lake explains that Supreme Court child support principles exist to protect children and families from prolonged uncertainty, even when the discovery of paternity occurs decades later. The daughter's internal conflict remains evident. She expresses hesitation about forming any immediate relationship, a response Judge Lauren Lake validates without hesitation. The court clarifies that legal determination does not require emotional acceptance. This distinction is critical in understanding the relationship between law and justice. Law establishes fact. Justice allows space for healing. The courtroom does not demand reconciliation, only recognition. The mother's position is addressed one final time. Judge Lauren Lake speaks directly about the long-term impact of withheld truth. She explains that while the court does not exist to punish past behavior, it does exist to prevent its continuation. The judge frames this as a lesson in accountability rather than condemnation, aligning with the broader concept of justice in jurisprudence, where acknowledgement of harm is often the first step toward repair. As emotions cool, the court reflects on how easily misinformation can solidify into belief over time. The earlier confusion surrounding missing paperwork and disputed DNA tests is revisited as an example of why evidence must be documented, preserved, and verified. Judge Lauren Lake explains adverse inference in Evidence Act reasoning in plain terms, noting that absence of proof often leads to assumptions that cause deeper harm than confirmed facts ever could. The discussion widens briefly to include generational impact. The court acknowledges that unresolved paternity does not stop with one individual. Children inherit stories, doubts, and unanswered questions. This is why cases like this mirror themes found in adoption stories' full episodes, where identity remains incomplete until truth is established. Judge Lauren Lake emphasizes that resolving these questions now protects future generations from carrying the same uncertainty. In her closing remarks, Judge Lauren Lake addresses the emotional aftermath directly. She notes that many people enter court believing a DNA test will deliver peace, only to discover that it delivers responsibility instead. This insight reflects ideas often explored in the Truth Changes Everything podcast, where guests describe how factual clarity forces difficult emotional adjustments. The judge reminds the courtroom that truth does not promise comfort, only certainty. The confirmed father is encouraged to approach the future with humility and patience. Judge Lauren Lake makes it clear that trust, once broken or absent, cannot be demanded. It must be earned over time through consistent behavior. This guidance reflects discussions common in the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, where legal outcomes are framed as opportunities for corrective action rather than personal victory. The daughter is reminded that her identity is not diminished by the circumstances of her conception. Judge Lauren Lake stresses that worth is not defined by secrecy, affairs, or delayed truth. This reassurance aligns with themes found in Celebrate Recovery testimonies, where individuals separate personal value from inherited pain. The court acknowledges her strength in seeking answers, regardless of how difficult those answers turned out to be. As the judge prepares to adjourn, she reiterates a core principle. The court's responsibility ends with the delivery of truth, but moral responsibility continues beyond it. She encourages all parties to consider counseling, reflection, and deliberate communication moving forward. This advice echoes ideas often discussed in the Divorce Course podcast, where structured guidance helps individuals navigate post-resolution realities. The courtroom atmosphere shifts noticeably as final statements conclude. There is no applause, no sense of triumph. Instead, there is a shared recognition that something irreversible has occurred. The daughter leaves with certainty that challenges her expectations. The father leaves with accountability he must now decide how to honor. The mother leaves with the undeniable weight of past choices fully illuminated. Judge Lauren Lake formally closes the session, reminding everyone that the court has done what it is designed to do: apply evidence, determine fact, and uphold justice. She makes no promises about healing, only about fairness. This distinction reinforces the integrity of the legal process and the limits of its reach. In the end, this courtroom story stands as a comprehensive example of how DNA testing intersects with emotion, responsibility, and law. It shows how people regret taking truth lightly, how delayed answers compound pain, and how clarity, though difficult, is necessary. Under Judge Lauren Lake's guidance, the court demonstrates that justice is not about comfort, but about honesty grounded in evidence. The case concludes with certainty established, denial dismantled, and the path forward clearly defined, even if emotionally uncertain. It affirms a simple but powerful reality. Once truth enters the courtroom, it cannot be undone, only understood, and it changes everything.